Brianna, see your dad. He is a poor car washer. He is washing my dad's car. He is not my dad. How can this car washer be my dad? He is just an innocent car washer.
She called her own father an ordinary poor car washer. She mocked him. She denied him in front of everyone. The same father she had slept under the same roof with the night before. She humiliated him without mercy. Even her mother called her husband a disgrace, even after he gave up his work just to take care of them. But what none of them knew was that the man they were laughing at had just handed over a company worth billions of dollars. For them, there is a particular kind of silence that only a broken man understands. It is the silence of a person who has stopped explaining himself to a world that already decided who he is. The man you just watched, standing in that car wash with a hose in his hand while his own daughter laughed in his face, had been there since 7 that morning, washing one vehicle after another, getting paid by the count, like any other laborer. Nobody knew his name. Nobody asked. And his 17-year-old daughter had just looked directly into his eyes and told her friend that the man washing cars could not possibly be her father. He did not argue. He did not cry. He simply kept working, because David Calloway had learned a long time ago that the truth does not always need to defend itself. Sometimes the truth simply waits. It all began with the complaints. For years, his wife and his daughter had said the same thing, over and over, in 100 different ways, that he was never home, that his schedule always came first, that he gave his work more love than he ever gave his own family. His daughter needed a father who was present, not a name on a bank account. His wife was tired of living alone inside a marriage, raising their child in a house where the man of the family was always somewhere else. They told him he was absent. They told him he had chosen his career over the people who were supposed to matter most. And David Calloway, a man who had never lost an argument in a boardroom in his life, had no defense for this one. Because they were right. Before we reached the night that 500 people watched a single moment change everything. Before the will hidden in a drawer, before a daughter sat on a cold floor and wept for what she had done, you have to understand how a man like David Calloway ends up invisible. 3 questions will carry this entire story, and I want you to hold on to each one. First, how does a man sign away a billion-dollar empire without telling his own wife? And why would any man do such a thing? Second, what kind of woman watches her husband humiliated at her own birthday party in front of her friends and laughs? And third, the question that will stay with you long after this ends, when the truth finally comes out: who pays the real price? Everyone in this story believed they knew David Calloway. Not one of them knew anything at all. David Calloway was not born into money. He built it. He started with 11 employees and a rented office that flooded every time it rained. And over 2 decades, he turned that small, struggling operation into Pinnacle Group, a company spanning construction, real estate, financial services, and private logistics. He did it the way certain men do, through 18-hour days, through relentless focus, through a refusal to quit that bordered on something unhealthy. By the time the company reached the top, David was the kind of man whose signature appeared on enormous contracts, but whose face never appeared in a newspaper. He preferred the shadows. He believed that the moment people start talking about you, they stop watching what you are actually doing. And so he stayed quiet, stayed hidden, and let the work speak. The work always spoke. The problem was that the work was the only thing speaking at all. At home, there was a wife named Nicole, a daughter named Brianna, 17 years old, sharp and social and painfully conscious of how things looked to other people. There was a beautiful house in a beautiful neighborhood, and a life that, from the outside, looked like everything a person could want. But from the inside, from where Nicole stood, from where Brianna sat at a dinner table, with an empty chair across from her, that life looked like one long absence. David was always somewhere else. A meeting in another city, a deal that could not wait, a phone call that pulled him out of a room before he had even taken off his coat. He was providing everything and present for nothing. And slowly, without anyone naming it out loud, the family began to live around the hole where a husband and father was supposed to be. The complaints had been building for 3 years before David finally heard them. Nicole would say it at dinner, in that calm and tired voice that lands so much harder than shouting ever could. "You are not a husband," she told him once. "You are a bank transfer. Brianna does not even mention you to her friends anymore. Do you know that? She used to be so proud of her father, and now she acts like she does not have one." Brianna said the same thing in a different language, the language teenagers use, which is behavior instead of words. She stopped saving him a seat. She stopped calling when she was out late. She stopped the small daily rituals that children keep with parents they feel close to. She was not angry exactly. She had simply moved on without him, the way you move past a house you no longer live in. David heard all of it, and unlike most men in his position, he did not dismiss it. He sat with it for months. He turned it over the same way he turned over a failing business unit, looking for the root cause, the real problem beneath the surface complaints. And he arrived at a conclusion that almost no man with his wealth would ever act upon. The problem was him. The problem was the time. The problem was that he had spent 20 years proving he could provide, and 0 years proving he could simply be there. So he made a decision in the quiet of his own mind. And once David Calloway decided something, it was already done. He was going to give them what they had asked for. He was going to come home, and he was going to give up the one thing that had always come first, no matter the cost. On a Friday morning, he called his personal assistant into his office. Her name was Rachel, and she had been with Pinnacle Group for 6 years. She was precise, fiercely capable, more competent than half the executives on the board, and David trusted her completely. He told her he needed her to take over, full operational control of the entire company. The board would be informed of a restructuring, and she would have every authority she needed to run Pinnacle Group in his place. Rachel stared at him as if she had misheard. "Sir," she said, "you are asking me to run the company." "Yes," he answered. "For how long?" she asked. And David was quiet for a long moment before he said the only honest thing he could. "As long as it takes." He did not tell her what he was really doing. He did not tell anyone the truth. He did not tell Nicole. He did not tell Brianna. He simply came home one ordinary morning and was there, present at breakfast for the first time in years, available for the school run, sitting at the dinner table every single evening, with nowhere else he needed to be. He learned the names of Brianna's friends. He started helping Nicole with small things around the house, before she even asked. He was doing precisely what they had begged him to do for 3 long years. But something had already shifted in that house, something he had not accounted for. The complaints had run for so long that the people making them no longer knew how to live without them. Nicole had grown so used to her grievance that, without it, she seemed restless and almost lost. The attention David now poured out did not fill her. It seemed to irritate a place in her that had already moved somewhere else entirely. And so David Calloway, a man who had run a billion-dollar empire, found himself sitting in a silent house that no longer felt like a home, with nothing to do and nowhere to be. He could not sit still. He had never in his life been a man who could sit still. So he did something that, to anyone who knew his real identity, would have seemed insane. He drove to a local car wash on the edge of town, and he registered to work there under a name that was not his own. He showed up in the mornings in plain clothes. He washed cars. He got paid by the count at the end of each day. And then he drove home in the evenings and said nothing about where he had been. He needed somewhere to exist where his presence was simply enough, where nobody was disappointed in him, where no standard kept changing beneath his feet. For about 3 weeks it worked. The car wash gave him something his own home no longer could, a place where the work was simple, and the expectations were clear, and a man was judged only by whether the car came out clean. And then came that Tuesday. The Tuesday you saw at the very beginning of this story. His daughter walking in with her friend, the pointing, the laughter, the words that cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal ever could. "He is not my dad. How can this dirty car washer be my dad?" David had stood there and absorbed every word of it, and inside his own mind a single thought had risen up almost loud enough to speak. My own daughter, rejecting me, in front of everyone. The friend's father had quietly paid him and tried to smooth it over. But the girls kept mocking until they drove away, and David turned to the next car and kept working. But that girl, the friend who had pointed and laughed, would matter later. Remember her. Her father owned the car that David had just finished washing, and that father was not a random stranger passing through town. That moment, that small, cruel moment in a dusty car wash, was a thread, and that thread ran all the way to a room filled with 500 people, where everything that happened on this Tuesday would come back around with a force that nobody in that parking lot could have imagined. But before that room, before that night, there was a bay party. And the birthday party would prove to be the moment David Calloway finally understood with total and terrible clarity exactly what his marriage had become while he had been busy trying with everything in him to save it. 3 weeks after the car wash, David came home to find his street lined bumper to bumper with parked cars. Music drifted from inside the house. Colored lights blinked behind the curtains. His wife Nicole had organized a birthday party for herself, and she had done it the way she did most things lately, without telling him, without inviting him into the planning, with the easy confidence of a woman who no longer considered her husband's feelings worth a single thought. David did not turn around. Instead, he stopped at a supermarket on his way in. He bought a cake, a nice one, nothing extravagant but thoughtful. He bought a card and a small bouquet of flowers from a bucket near the entrance. He stood in the checkout line in his plain clothes, a husband buying a birthday gift for his wife, and not one person around him had the faintest idea who he really was. He walked up to his own front door and he could already hear the laughter spilling out, the clinking of glasses, someone in the middle of giving a toast. He put his hand on the handle and pushed the door open. The living room was packed with people, dressed up, drinks in hand, music playing, and there, at the very center of it all, stood Nicole in a red dress David had never seen before. Beside her stood a man, and that man's hand rested low on her back, with the relaxed and practiced confidence of someone who had stood exactly there, many times before. Someone in the crowd called out over the music. "Kiss him," they shouted. "It is your birthday, Nicole. Kiss the man." Laughter erupted. More voices joined in, clapping, chanting, egging her on, and Nicole looked up and saw her husband standing in the doorway, holding a cake and a small bunch of flowers. Something crossed her face in that instant, and it was not shame, and it was not guilt. It was annoyance, the look of a woman whose evening had just been interrupted by something inconvenient. And then, while her husband stood in the doorway watching, Nicole turned to the man beside her and kissed him, fully, in their living room, in front of every guest. The crowd cheered as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Slowly, one by one, people began to notice the man frozen in the doorway, and the laughter started to soften, and glances were exchanged across the room. David stepped inside. "Nicole," he said, just her name, quietly. She turned to face him completely, and it was clear she wanted an audience for whatever was coming next, because her voice rose loud enough for the entire room to hear every word she was about to say. "Why are you ruining my party?" she demanded. "You always do this. You walk in and make everything about you." "I brought you a cake," David said simply. "I do not need your cake," she snapped, and stepped toward him. "You want the truth in front of everybody? This man right here beside me, he has been the one taking care of this family, not you. He shows up, he provides for me, he gives me the attention I deserve, the attention you never once gave me." The man beside her, well-dressed, an expensive watch on his wrist, the kind of man who moves through a room like he owns the floor beneath it, looked at David and smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won. From somewhere in the crowd, a single word floated out, "Loser," and a ripple of laughter followed it. David set the cake down on the nearest table. He looked at his wife. He looked at the smiling man beside her. He looked slowly around the room, at the faces of people who had eaten his food and stood inside his house and were now watching his humiliation, as if it were the evening's entertainment. And he said nothing at all. He simply turned and walked to the back of the house, sat down in a quiet room away from the music, and let the truth settle over him like cold water. The man with his hand on Nicole's back had a name. His name was Trevor Banks, and David did not know it yet, but Trevor Banks was an employee of Pinnacle Group. At that very moment, the man laughing in David's living room, the man kissing David's wife, was collecting a paycheck signed, at the very top of the chain, by David Calloway himself. And before we go any further into this story, I want to say something to you directly. Please, if you are new to this channel, encourage us by subscribing if you have not already. It will cost you nothing, and it means absolutely everything to us. Now let me tell you what happened next, because what happened next is where this story truly begins to turn. The morning after the birthday party, Nicole came downstairs while David was making coffee, and she placed a folder on the kitchen counter without so much as a good morning. "I want a divorce," she said flatly. "I have already spoken to a lawyer. These are the initial papers. I want you to read them." David looked at the folder for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup and said only, "I will read them." He did not sign that day. He was not refusing out of pride or stubbornness. He was refusing because some quiet part of him was still not finished deciding, because somewhere beneath all the hurt he had not entirely given up, and there was one more thing he needed to see with his own eyes before he closed the door on his marriage forever. So he took the papers upstairs and placed them, unsigned, in a drawer. The threats continued, day after day. Some days they came loud, sharp words across the kitchen. Other days they came as silence. Nicole moving through the house as though her husband were a piece of furniture to be navigated around rather than a person to be spoken to. And Trevor Banks became an ever more visible presence in their lives. Phone calls at all hours, late evenings. Nicole making no effort whatsoever to hide any of it, as if hiding it would have required acknowledging that David's feelings still existed. Then one ordinary morning, a silver luxury car was dropped off at the car wash. No driver waited with it. Someone had simply called ahead and arranged for it to be cleaned and collected later. David did not know whose car it was, and it did not matter to him. He cleaned it the way he cleaned every vehicle that came through, thoroughly, carefully, without ever once cutting a corner. He was finishing the interior when he heard footsteps approaching across the lot, and he turned around. Trevor Banks was walking toward him, dressed sharp, sunglasses on, moving with that same proprietary ease David had watched him display in his own living room. And half a step behind him, dressed up and clearly going somewhere, walked Nicole. Trevor stopped at the silver car and looked it over, and then his eyes landed on the man who had washed it. Something clicked behind them. He recognized David from the birthday party, the husband, the man who had stood in the doorway holding a cake. A slow smile spread across his face. "Look at this," he said, turning to Nicole with open delight. "Your husband washed my car." Nicole looked at David, and if there was a flicker of something human in her, some last fragment of the woman he had married, it did not survive more than a heartbeat before she looked away. "Where are you going?" David asked, and his voice stayed quiet and level. "Nicole, you are still my wife. Where are you going, dressed like this with this man?" Trevor laughed, full and comfortable and entirely unworried. "She is going with me," he said. "That is where she is going. And there is nothing in this world you can do about it." "Car washer, you are pathetic," Nicole added, her voice flat and tired. "You gave up everything you ever had. You cannot even hold your own family together. Standing here washing other people's cars like a nobody." Then Trevor reached into his pocket and pulled out the payment for the car wash. But instead of placing it in David's hand, he threw it. The bills scattered across the wet concrete at David's feet, some sticking to the damp ground, others tumbling sideways in the light breeze. "Buy yourself something nice," Trevor said. They climbed into the silver car together and drove away, and Nicole did not look back even once. David stood in the same spot where 3 weeks earlier his own daughter had denied knowing him. He looked down at the money scattered across the concrete at his feet, and then he bent down slowly, and he picked it up, bill by bill. He did not snatch at it or crumple it in anger. He gathered each note, smoothed it flat between his fingers, and placed it carefully into his pocket, the way a man gathers the last pieces of something that has finally finished breaking. That evening he drove home, walked upstairs to his room, opened the drawer, and took out the divorce papers Nicole had given him. And without a single word, without anger, without ceremony, David Calloway signed them. He was done trying to save something that had already made up its mind to burn to the ground. 3 months passed. Then, on an ordinary Wednesday morning, Rachel found him. She pulled into the car wash in a car that cost more than the entire business earned in a month, and she sat behind the wheel for a moment, watching David work before she opened the door and stepped out. Charcoal business suit, heels on the wet concrete, a tablet tucked under her arm. She looked entirely out of place, and she did not appear the least bit concerned about it. David looked up when he heard the car door close, and something moved across his face that was almost, but not quite, a smile. He had been wondering when this day would finally come. "Rachel," he said. "Sir," she answered, and she walked straight toward him with the directness she brought to everything. "The company needs you back. There are decisions only you can make. We need you to come home. We have been running at 90% capacity for 3 years now," she continued, "and I mean that in every possible sense of the word. There are things I cannot authorize. There are doors that only open for you. The board has been patient, more patient than I ever expected them to be. But their patience is not endless, and the truth is we need you. We need the last 10% that only you can give." David set down the cloth he had been holding and was quiet for a moment. I hear you, he said. And then Rachel hesitated, because what came next was not part of the briefing she had prepared in the car. She was a careful woman who rarely said things she had not thought through in advance. But something in the stillness of him, in the way he stood there unhurried and unbothered, like a man who had made peace with a thing most people fight their whole lives, pulled the words out of her. I also want to say something to you personally, she said, more quietly now. If your hesitation has anything to do with your family, then you should know that you deserve far better than what you have been given. You deserve someone who actually sees you. Someone who, Rachel, Dave said gently, stopping her before she could finish. I know what you are saying, and I am grateful for it, truly I am, but that is not a door I am ready to open, not now. I am not finished hoping that my family can still be put back together. Maybe that makes me a fool, but I have to try one last thing before I can accept that it is truly over. Rachel straightened, composed herself, and gave a single professional nod. Understood, she said. And in that one word she put away whatever she had been about to offer, and became, once again, exactly what he needed her to be. Tell the board I am coming back, David said, and I want it done properly. I want a formal ceremony, a large one. Shareholders, partners, the entire company present in one room. After 9 years in the shadows, I am going to step back into the light, and I want every single person there to see it happen. He paused, and something cool and deliberate settled into his eyes. Who would you assign? He asked, to plan an event of that scale. Rachel pulled up a name on her tablet. Trevor Banks, she said. He runs our events and stakeholder relations division. He is genuinely very good at what he does. For just a moment, something passed through David's expression, quiet and precise, like a key turning silently in a lock. Perfect, he said softly. Let Trevor Banks plan it. He already knew exactly what Trevor Banks did not. The divorce was moving through its slow legal process now. Lawyers exchanged documents. The house had become 2 separate countries, with an invisible border running straight down the center of the hallway. Nicole spent more and more time away. Brianna moved quietly through the rooms, going to school, coming home, studying, and she and her father occupied the same spaces, without ever once speaking of what had happened that day at the car wash. Some things hang in the air far too heavy for anyone to reach up and take down. But David had made one final decision, one last thing he needed to do before he closed this chapter of his life completely. He was going to give Nicole one last chance. Not a conversation, not a confrontation, a test. A single quiet moment in which she would choose freely, without ever knowing that she was being watched, and her choice would tell him everything. He found her at the kitchen table one morning, and sat down across from her. There is an event next Friday, he said. I need you to come with me. Nicole looked up from her phone. What event? She asked. A professional function, he answered. It is important to me. I would like you to be there, with me as my wife. She studied him for a moment, then looked back down at her phone. I have plans that day, she said. I am asking you to change them, he replied. Nicole set the phone down with the practiced patience of someone who had had this conversation too many times, sis. David, she said, we are divorcing. I do not need to accompany you to work functions anymore. We are finished. The sooner you accept that, the better it will be for both of us. David looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, stood up, and walked upstairs without another word. What David did not know, the detail that would make this moment almost unbearable to look back on, was that Trevor Banks had called Nicole the night before. He had told her to dress beautifully on Friday, because the largest company event in years was taking place, the long-awaited return of the mysterious overall chief executive of Pinnacle Group after 9 years away. He had told her it was the most important night of his career, that he needed her there beside him, that this was their moment to step into the light together. And Nicole had said yes immediately, without hesitation. She had been invited to the exact same event by both her husband and the man she was leaving him for. She had said no to one and yes to the other, and she had made that choice with absolutely no idea what it would eventually cost her, no idea that she had just walked herself directly toward the wreckage. Friday arrived. David dressed quietly and alone in his room. He did not tell Nicole where he was going. He left the house by himself, drove across the city to the headquarters of Pinnacle Group, and slipped in through a private side entrance that only a handful of people in the entire building even knew existed. 1 hour later, Nicole arrived at the front of that same building, on the arm of Trevor Banks, wearing a blue dress, smiling, glowing, certain that she was walking into the best night of her new life. She had no idea whose return she was about to celebrate. She had no idea that the man she had laughed at, the man she had divorced, the man who had picked her boyfriend's thrown money off the wet ground, was standing somewhere inside that building, waiting, and Brianna, brought along at her mother's insistence, walked in just behind them, uncomfortable in her dress, with no idea at all. The grand atrium of Pinnacle Group headquarters had been completely transformed. Trevor Banks had done his good job, and he had done it well. Banners hung from the ceiling. Flowers covered every surface. A stage stood at the front with a podium, and behind it the company logo glowed enormous and proud. Round tables draped in white linen filled the floor, and 500 people, employees and shareholders and partners, stood dressed in their finest clothes, champagne glasses in hand, filling the vast room with the particular electric murmur of a crowd that has been waiting a very long time for something, because not one person in that entire room knew what the overall chief executive actually looked like. That had always been deliberate. David Calloway had run his empire through proxies, through Rachel, through careful arrangements built specifically to keep his face out of the public eye. They all knew the name. None of them had ever seen the man. Trevor moved through the atrium in his element, an earpiece in, his tablet out, directing staff and checking timelines with the smooth confidence of a man at the peak of his career. Nicole stood nearby, being introduced to important people, enjoying every moment of the attention. Brianna stood slightly apart from the crowd, the way teenagers stand at adult events, present, but not really part of it. And then a word began to move through the room like an electric current passing from person to person. "He is here, the chief executive has arrived." The crowd turned. Near the far wall, standing with his back to the entire room, looking out through the tall glass windows toward the city skyline, stood a figure in a dark suit, perfectly still, in no hurry at all, the silhouette of a man who had waited 9 years for this exact moment and would not be rushed through a single second of it. Trevor crossed the floor quickly, his staff trailing behind him, because this was the moment his entire event had been built around. He gestured for the crowd to gather close. He straightened his jacket, and he approached the still figure at the window, with Nicole just behind him and Brianna a few paces further back. "Sir," Trevor said, his voice carrying the polished confidence of a man in command of his finest night. "Welcome back. On behalf of all of Pinnacle Group, we have been expecting you for 9 long years, and we are deeply honored to finally receive you." And all around the enormous room, 500 people began to applaud, many of them bowing their heads slightly in the genuine, collective respect of people welcoming home someone they had waited nearly a decade to meet. Nicole smiled, proud to be standing so near the center of it all. Brianna watched, and the figure at the window did not move. Then slowly he turned around, and the room recognized the face before the 3 people closest to him did. Trevor Banks saw it first. The applause was still ringing through the atrium when the recognition struck him like a speeding car. The man from the birthday party, the husband who had stood in the doorway holding a cake, the car washer whose payment he had thrown contemptuously onto the wet concrete. The color drained completely from Trevor Banks's face. Nicole saw it half a second later, and her hand flew up to cover her mouth as she took an involuntary step backward. Brianna went utterly, completely still. The applause was beginning to falter now as the people nearest the front sensed that something had gone terribly wrong, that the careful script of the evening had broken somewhere. And the whole atmosphere of the room shifted in an instant, the way a room shifts when hundreds of people realize at once that they are watching something they were never meant to see. And then Trevor Banks did the single worst thing a man in his position could possibly do. He did it out of pure panic, out of the desperate flailing reflex of a man who watches his entire world collapsing in real time and grabs blindly for the only tool he has ever known, which was force and intimidation. He stepped forward, and he struck David Calloway hard across the face. The sound of it cut through the silent atrium like a blade through fabric, and 500 people stopped breathing all at once. "Security," Trevor shouted, his voice shaking even as he tried to make it commanding. "This man is an imposter. Get him out of here. Remove him immediately." He spun toward the security officials stationed at the entrance. "I want him removed from this building right now." The officials looked at one another. They looked at the calm man who had just been struck. They looked at Trevor, and they did not move a single inch. and then Rachel walked out from the side of the stage. She crossed the floor of the atrium in the kind of total silence that only exists when 500 people are holding their breath at the very same moment. She walked directly up to Trevor Banks, stopped in front of him, and looked at him with an expression that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Do you understand what you have just done?" she said, and her voice was perfectly, terrifyingly level. "This man, the man you just struck across the face in front of this entire company, is David Calloway. He is the founder and the overall chief executive of Pinnacle Group. Everything in this building, every contract, every paycheck, including the very position you have held for the last 4 years, exists only because this man built it from nothing." The room did not make a sound. Trevor opened his mouth, and nothing at all came out of it. "Your employment with Pinnacle Group is terminated," Rachel said, as evenly as if she were reading the time. "Effective this very moment. Security, please escort Mr. Banks out of the building." And this time, the security personnel moved. Trevor Banks, the man who had thrown money onto wet concrete at a car wash, the man who had kissed another man's wife at her birthday party, while that husband stood holding a cake, the man who had just slapped the chief executive of the company that employed him in front of 500 witnesses, was walked out of the building he had worked in for 4 years. Nicole stood alone in the middle of the atrium floor in her beautiful blue dress, surrounded by hundreds of people, with absolutely nowhere to go and nothing left to say. Brianna had still not moved. She stood frozen, staring at her father, her face moving through shame and recognition and grief all at once, too fast for any of it to settle. And David Calloway stood at the very center of it all, 500 people around him, the red mark of Trevor's hand still fresh on his cheek, and he was completely composed, completely still. Exactly the same way he had stood in the car wash with the hose dripping in his hand. Exactly the same way he had stood in the doorway of his own home holding a birthday cake. The men who had tried to make him small had finally found out who he was, and the discovery had cost them everything. David looked at his wife, standing lost in the crowd. He looked at his daughter, frozen and pale, and without a word, he turned and walked toward the stage, where the entire company of Pinnacle Group was waiting to receive the man they had wondered about for 9 years. The man none of them had ever seen. The man who had been quietly washing their cars. They went home that evening in complete silence, in separate cars. The house felt different the moment Nicole and Brianna walked back into it, as though the walls had quietly shifted while they were gone, as though every piece of furniture had been rearranged overnight, even though nothing had moved at all. It was the kind of change that happens not in a place but inside a person's understanding of it. Nicole went straight to her room and did not come out. Brianna sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. Then she rose and climbed the stairs, looking for something, a phone charger, a book. She would never afterward remember exactly what. She walked into her father's study and opened the top drawer of his desk. And there, tucked beneath a folder and a small stack of older papers, she found an envelope with her own name written on the front of it. Inside the envelope was a legal document, a will, or at least the portion of one that concerned her directly. Brianna read it slowly, and then, certain she had misunderstood, she read it through a second time. Her father had allocated to her, to Brianna Calloway, his only daughter, a 43% ownership stake in all of Pinnacle Group along with the family estate and 3 additional properties. And at the bottom she saw the date. The document had been drawn up 2 full years earlier, before the car wash, before the birthday party, before any of the cruelty, before a single one of the words she had thrown at him. While she had been busy building walls between herself and her father, while she had been denying him in front of her friends, he had quietly, patiently been building her entire future. Brianna sank down onto the floor of her father's study with the document trembling in her hands. She thought about standing in that car wash with her friend. She thought about lifting her chin and announcing, without a moment of hesitation, that the man washing cars could not possibly be her father. She thought about how light she had felt in that instant, how relieved that she had not been claimed in public by something she found embarrassing. She could hear her own voice perfectly, every cold and final word of it, and she began to cry. It was not quiet crying. It was the kind that rises up from somewhere deep, the kind that has been building for far longer than the person ever realized, breaking out all at once. She sat on the floor of her father's study, holding nearly half of a multi-billion-dollar company in her shaking hands. And she wept for the man she had been too ashamed to call her father, the man who had given her everything while she gave him nothing but distance and denial. Then she rose, walked down the hall, and pushed open the door to her mother's room. Nicole was sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing the blue dress, staring at the wall. "Look at this, Brianna," said her voice rough and broken. She held out the document. "Look at what he did for me. Look at what he was doing for me the entire time, while we treated him like he was nothing, while you had him standing in a car wash being laughed at, while you kissed another man in his own living room." Nicole took the papers and read them, and whatever was left holding her face together quietly came undone. "He gave me almost everything," Brianna said, "and now he has told us to leave his house. Because of what we did to him. Because of what you put inside my head about my own father." Her voice cracked straight down the middle. "I loved him. I always loved him." "We are going to him," Brianna said, wiping her face. "Tonight. And we are going to beg." David was sitting in his study when they arrived. He had known they would come, not out of arrogance, but out of the quiet understanding of a man who had spent years learning to read the people closest to him. He heard the front door. He heard footsteps on the stairs. He did not get up from his chair. They came in together, Brianna first, which surprised him slightly, and Nicole close behind her. Brianna crossed the room and knelt down on the floor in front of her father's chair. For a moment she could not speak at all. Then she held out the document with both hands. "I found this," she finally managed. "I understand now. I understand what you were doing the entire time, and I am so sorry. I am so sorry for the car wash. I am sorry for all of it. I knew it was you." Brianna wept. "I always knew it was you. I was just so ashamed of something that I should have been proud of every single day of my life. I was ashamed of my own father, and you gave me everything anyway." David looked at his daughter for a long time, the daughter who had denied him in front of strangers, and he reached out and placed his hand gently on the top of her head, the same quiet gesture fathers have made since the beginning of time. "I know," he said softly. "That was all. I know." Then Nicole stepped forward from near the doorway, and every trace of the hardness was gone from her now. The impatience, the entitlement, all of it stripped away. "David," she said, in a voice he had not heard from her in many years, "I know I have no right to ask you for anything at all. I know that, but I am begging you. Please do not end this," Nicole pleaded. "Please let me come back. I will do anything. I know exactly what I did, and I know exactly what I threw away, and I will spend the rest of my life making it right if you will only let me. Please." David looked at his wife for a long, long moment, long enough that the silence in the room grew heavy and thick around all three of them, and then he said one word, "No." Nicole flinched as if she had been struck. "I tried," David said, and there was no anger anywhere in his voice, only the absolute and final calm of a man who has closed a door and then removed the handle from it entirely. "I handed over a company worth billions of dollars so that I could come home and be a husband to you. I washed cars with my own hands so I would not rot away alone in an empty house. I invited you to walk back into the light beside me, one last time, one final chance, and you chose Trevor. You chose the very man I was about to fire. You stood in my living room and kissed him while I held your birthday cake in my hands. You stood in a car wash and laughed at me while he threw money at my feet." David paused, and his voice never once rose. "I am not angry with you. Nicole, I want you to truly understand that. I am not angry, but I am done." Nicole stood in the middle of the room with her mouth slightly open and nowhere left in the entire world to go. Then David turned to his daughter, still kneeling on the floor. "You can stay," he told her gently. "This is your home. It has always been your home, and it always will be. Whatever happened between me and your mother does not change what you are to me. It never could. But I need one thing from you now," he said, looking down at Brianna with eyes that were gentle but absolutely direct. "I need your honesty from this day forward. No more performances. No more living and dying by how things look to other people. Your father washed cars with his own two hands. Your father also built one of the largest companies in this entire country from nothing at all. Both of those things are completely true at the same time. And neither one of them has anything whatsoever to do with whether you should be proud of the man who raised you." Brianna pressed both hands over her eyes and nodded, unable to speak. Nicole left the house that night. She walked out into the life she had chosen for herself, and she discovered very quickly that the man she had chosen it for was now unemployed, disgraced, blacklisted across the entire industry. and no longer answering any of her calls. David Calloway returned to Pinnacle Group the following Monday morning as its overall chief executive. The board welcomed him back without hesitation. The company moved forward, stronger than it had been in years, and Rachel returned quietly to her role at his side, with the same efficiency and discretion that had always defined her, never once mentioning the words she had almost said at the car wash, content simply to be exactly what he needed. And in the evening, when the long days of running an empire were finally finished, David drove home to a house where his daughter sat at the kitchen table doing her schoolwork, where there was food warming on the stove and soft light glowing in the windows, and the ordinary, priceless warmth of a home that had at last found its balance again. He had never needed the world to know what he had survived, and he did not need it now. He had signed away a company worth billions without a single word. He had washed strangers' cars without a word. He had signed his own divorce papers without a word, and he had picked his dignity up off the wet concrete bill by bill, without a word. He had done every bit of it for the people he loved. And in the end, only one of them had turned out to be worth it, but one was enough. Do you remember the friend from the car wash? The girl who pointed and laughed? The one whose father owned the car? That father had been an employee of Pinnacle Group for 11 years. He had been standing in that very atrium on the night of the return, and he had watched the entire thing unfold with his own eyes. He would never, for the rest of his life, forget the look on the chief executive's face in the very moment that he slowly turned around. There is a particular kind of strength that never announces itself. It does not demand recognition. It does not need a room to fall silent when it enters. It simply keeps going, through the mockery and the betrayal, through the birthday parties, and the car washes, and the money thrown onto wet ground. David Calloway possessed exactly that kind of strength, and the people closest to him mistook it for weakness right up until the very moment he turned around. And here is the thought I cannot let go of. Nicole did not lose David because he was absent. She lost him because the day he finally came home, completely, and at the cost of everything he had ever built, she had already decided in her heart that he was not enough. She stood in a room full of people who would have given anything to be in her place. And she spent that time laughing at him. So let me leave you with a question, and I want you to truly think about it before you answers. If you were David Calloway, if you had given up everything that he gave up and been humiliated in every way that he was humiliated, would you have taken your daughter back? Or would that day at the car wash have simply been too much to ever forgive? There is no easy answer, and I want to hear yours. So tell me in the comments below, because I read every single one of them. And if this story moved you, if you have ever been underestimated by someone who truly should have known better, then you already understand exactly what this channel is about. Subscribe and stay close, because the next story I have to tell you is going to be even harder to watch, and even harder to look away from. I will see you there.